we're here to talk about quite possibly one of the most important pieces of financial literacy that anybody can educate themselves on. And today is going to be a conversation about the causes, the real causes and effects of inflation.
At IB Canada Group, we are your complete and independent source on the infinite banking concept, serving Canadians from coast to coast.
This is meant to be an introductory video as we release a series of videos about inflation from some very well-respected economists and thought leaders about inflation, about the causes and effects of it. Wayne, what are your thoughts here today as we kind of dig into this topic?
Yeah, I think, Mike, I'm a big believer whenever we're in leadership, we need to use definitions around terminology. And so not just the causes and effects of inflation, but a really honest look at what is it? How would we define it? And understanding what it is will be very important. And so I find it, it's a fascinating subject to me. I mean, I am deeply, deeply enthralled in the conversation of inflation. But I have to be honest and say I don't meet many people that find it interesting. And I don't meet many people that want to engage in a conversation around inflation.
Yeah.
And as I began to mostly just dabble and stumble across, I began to realize that this is a very, very serious ill. And I began paying more and more attention to it. I began listening and watching. And I'm a pretty easily disturbed guy, but as I listen to the narrative of the system today, I'm going, that's not true. That's just not true. It's not accurate. It's not right. And therefore, the more I hear it and the more I hear people willingly and acceptingly embrace it, I'm saying, no, actually, you deserve to understand that what you believe to be true is just not quite true. It's not quite accurate. And that was my process, Mike, of just stumbling into it. And the more I began to look and understand, the more I'm going, wow, I'm a bit of an idealist, but I say inflation and greed should probably be looked at as almost synonymous. Where you find inflation, you will find greed. And if greed is a wrong word, then add stupidity. Because it's either greed or stupidity that causes people to create inflation.
Yeah. And I think greed is a very appropriate term, but and correct me if I'm wrong, but what we hear on the media, what we hear from politicians is pointing the finger at businesses. Businesses are greedy. Entrepreneurs are greedy. I mean, we've been hearing that from I won't mention any names, but his first name starts with Bill and his last name starts with Morneau, talking about the tax changes that they were making in the Liberals' first budget. And the narrative was really the first time I heard politicians so adamantly speak about how business owners are tax cheats, right? And so it's this narrative that keeps coming out saying, hey, the reason prices are going up is because businesses are greedy. And unfortunately, whether that's true or not, it doesn't really get to the root of the problem. And where the real greed is in the state. And the politicians are, of course, they're blaming the other side of the House of Commons. And now they're saying, oh, no, we gotta blame the people for rising prices. And certainly that's been the narrative that I've heard. Oh, it's Putin's fault. Oh, it's supply chain issues. And certainly there's some exacerbating issues but it doesn't get to the root. The root problem is devaluing the dollars, the currency that's floating around the system. And I've always suggested and told people that if you have an increasing amount of dollars chasing a limited supply of things, what's going to happen to the price of those things? Well, of course, they're going to increase. Now, couple that with the fact that production of goods and services have been diminished because of government institutional rules and mandates and things where we're not producing as many things. We're taking workers out of the employment industries and putting them on very enhanced welfare type programs, you have less people producing less goods with an increasing amount of supply of money. Well, now you're really taking supply and demand and making that a major factor in the price of things. But in reality, if people had a stable supply of money or even a decreasing supply of money in times where production was lower, well, then prices would be stable, right? We have to think of money being a unit of exchange, a commodity that can be produced and withdrawn out of the market at our peril if we don't realize what the primary consequences and secondary consequences of those actions are. What have you been hearing in terms of why people have been or what they've been blaming inflation on?
Well, certainly our media continues to point to, world affairs. Right now, the war in Ukraine, they're saying, due to the war in Ukraine, inflation is driving up the cost of fuel. And I'm going, I'm a little dogmatic, but no, it's not. Inflation is not driving up the cost of fuel. Limited supply and war and difficulties in relationships are going to make fuel a rare commodity or a commodity that's in high demand, and people will pay what they have to pay to access the things that they need. And when limited supply is there, prices are going to go up, but that's not inflation. That's just an increased market value based on supply and demand. And so I keep hearing all these different narratives coming particularly out of our media, but then what appears to be a lack of ability to think and understand what's actually happening because we haven't taken the time to go back to the root. And so there's a history around inflation that I think people need to understand. They need to pay attention to. And so I'm fascinated that it's been going on for so long. I mean, it's centuries and more than centuries old. It's thousands of years old. And it dates back to Caesar. It dates back to all kinds of leaders across the globe that in their greed had access to diluting the money supply. And they did it and they got away with it. But when they did it, it was downright evil. They knew what they were doing. They knew that what they were doing was wrong because they were melting things down and then reproducing in molds to create more. And so what they ended up with was a diluted money supply. And, when Morneau talks about business leaders being greedy, I'm going, business leaders aren't greedy, they're smart. Business leaders understand that if you want to dilute their dollar, they're going to have to charge more dollars for their product in order to recoup what they've actually invested into their product in order to keep their margins up. And that's just the way business works. And it should be the way the government works. A fair exchange for a fair dollar. And so, unfortunately, everything gets passed on to the consumer, and probably we shouldn't be blaming business. We should be blaming the people that actually perpetrated the issue to start with, which is an overproduction of the money supply. Mike, I mean, you'll wax eloquent on this, but just maybe speak quickly to Nixon taking us off the gold standard and what might have been the impetus for him choosing to do so.
Well, I'm going to try and condense that because that's a loaded question. We could talk very long about economic policies in the 30s. For example, when FDR created the New Deal and signed an executive order banning the ownership of large amounts of gold. We could talk about the creation of the Federal Reserve System throughout all of the world, whether that's central banking in particular, or later on through the World Bank and the IMF. But essentially, and I think Mike Maloney, if anybody wants to do any research on the history of money, there's a YouTube video. It's only about 10 minutes long, and it's literally labeled 10 minutes of monetary history, or monetary history in 10 minutes by Mike Maloney from his Hidden Secrets of Money video series. And he talks a lot about how the kind of the history, the modern history of the dollar when we were on a full reserve system, then we went to a partial reserve system, then we went in 1944 to a system called Bretton Woods. And what Bretton Woods did is it tied the US dollar to gold, and then all other currencies were pegged to the US dollar. Well, what happened was the Americans, their central bank kept printing more and more money, and they were expropriating, or expatriating those dollars overseas to buy goods and services, and they were trading using the US dollar as a world reserve currency, all coming from a centralized monopoly called the US Federal Reserve. Now, some countries, especially France, in the 60s, started recognizing that this was a bit of a fraud. And they said, okay, well, we're going to give you back your US dollars, and we're going to take back the gold that was on reserve, holding the value of that. And what Nixon had to do, otherwise it would have been a complete failure of Bretton Woods, was he, on August 15th, 1971, closed the gold window. And so what that essentially meant is that it was no longer redeemable in gold for dollars. What happened after that? There's a fun title of a website called WTF Happened in 1971. And it talks about how as soon as they took the gold standard away, as soon as they said, okay, well, our dollar is now going to float in an international floating system of currencies called fiat currencies, and that's the modern monetary system, is where all currencies float against each other. Now that had no anchor on those dollars, you can print in unlimited supply dollars. What happened in 1971 to 78, during Carter's time, was massive stagflation after years of wildly printing dollars, and gold went from $35 an ounce to a measure of stability at about $800. It peaked up in the late 70s. Why? Because people realized that the dollars were worth so much less when you don't have something to tether it to. And that's the big danger of not putting, to your bull example, if it was springtime and you had that bull running around, but you didn't have him in a pen, well, what's going to happen to that bull? He's going to run all over the field. He's going to make a disaster of the entire farm. Well, that's exactly what happened with government. As soon as you took off the pen away from those who controlled a monopoly of the money supply, they went rampant. And we in order to correct the dangers of the 1970 going on for decades, Paul Volcker in 1981-82 set interest rates at about 21%. I know Peter Schiff talks about this all the time. You cannot have inflation. If you want to control it, you've got to increase the interest rates above the inflation rates in order to control it. And a friend of mine, I'll try and remember the quote, I'll probably butcher it, but he said, basically, the interest rates must rise in order to control inflation. And my response on social media was, the beatings will continue until morale improves, kind of thing, right? So without the restraint of government, if you don't restrain the actions of government, it will become a leviathan, as Thomas Hobbes wrote in the 1500s.
Yeah, and I think what ultimately happens is accountability goes out the window. There's virtually no way to reconcile your records. And it's very difficult if it can be done, and accountability begins to wane. And pretty soon we don't even government doesn't even expect to be held accountable. They believe they like to portray that they're addressing the ills of society and they're the hero. And I'm saying, actually, when you overproduce the money supply, my mom was an amazing cook. And we lived on a farm, and periodically I'd bring my buddies home. Sometimes the whole hockey team, the bus would stop at the farm. And I was one of those kids that never called ahead to tell mom. We just showed up. And at supper time, and mom would somehow make that food taste good. But if the group was too large, she had to dilute the food too much, and we lost the taste and the flavor. And I'm going, I eat at this table every day, and I know what it's supposed to taste like. And I know what it tastes like if I bring two buddies home, I can't tell the difference. But when I bring home 20, supper doesn't taste quite the same because it got diluted. Mom had to add things, filler to try and that's what really inflation is about. You overproduce and you begin to dilute. And there's only so many cups of water that can go in the soup before you might as well be just drinking the bathtub. It's just the way it is. And I'm going, let's not become confused or distracted by what inflation is. Inflation isn't, gas prices don't go up largely because of inflation. They go up because of supply and demand. And if there's a shortage, and there's all kinds of reasons why there might be a shortage, but inflation is when you overproduce the money supply.
Can we be very clear, though? We're not advocating to drink bathwater. I just want to
you know what? You're going to do what you got to do when the situation gets bad enough. And I think that's part of, what drives me is to say, let's get on this before it really kills us, because we're not headed in a very good direction. This is probably going to be a little strong, but if we don't figure this out and begin to combat it, where will this bus take us, Mike? Let me throw that ball to you. Where will this bus take us if it doesn't get corrected?
Well, there's only 2 or 3 really main things that can happen with an inflation problem. And let's be clear, this is a monetary supply issue. This is not a greedy business person that's creating this problem. So let's start with that premise. So based on central bank policy, whether they're buying bonds from the government or they're buying market bonds, private company investments, if those private companies now take their increased money and deposit it into the banking system, well, the bank's going to lend 9 times on that through fractional reserve system. But, to answer your question, I think what's going to happen is either we have a soft landing, right? Which means the economy fixes itself. The government can't fix the economy. So the economy has to fix itself and heal itself in order for us to come in for a soft landing. The second possible outcome is a prolonged period of inflation where we have a prolonged and problematic 7, 8, 9, 10% inflation. Or the third and most frightening example or outcome would be a situation of hyperinflation. And we look to modern history, Weimar Republic, Germany, just 2 decades ago or even currently with Venezuela, Zimbabwe. We look at even the United States in the 60s through the Lyndon Johnson and JFK years. Some things were going up by 21% annually. Why? Because this idea that you should print money in order to escape or to create a large warfare welfare system. You need money to do that. And in order to fight the war in Vietnam, they had to print exacerbating amounts of just obscene amounts of money in order to do that. Nobody's buying war bonds for Vietnam, right? It's a very insidious, to your point earlier, whether it was during this actual recorded part or when it was our previous, prior to recording, pushing the record button, you're talking about inflation being an insidious tax, a very silent killer of wealth. And I think that's a view shared by many economists as of late and throughout history. So, yeah.
And I think increased dependency, that's what society will end up with. The increased dependency, which leads to increased appetite by governments to offer more and do more and control more. And pretty soon you've got a society that is very, very dependent upon government provision. And given that they have no money whatsoever to work with, they have money to work with because they get it from systems, but they themselves don't have any money. It's interesting to me that we would become so dependent on them. And, I'm a bit dogmatic. I'm a little bit of an idealist. But at the end of the day, we have this problem and it's a human problem, and it's a solvable problem, but it's not solvable unless you understand it and then begin to be able to put mechanisms of accountability in place that stop the people that are running the presses and buying their position, buying their vote, whatever it is. This is not the solution to the problem. And I think one of the things, Mike, I find a bit disheartening is that you can change parties, you can change government parties, but at the end of the day, we've created this problem that is not solvable until the public actually begins to step in and say, stop it. And we're nowhere close to hearing the public stop in to say, stop it.
Well, it's the whether you call it an orgy of money or the lust of money, that dependence becomes a complete dependence and a complete addiction to money, because it's easy up front. And unfortunately, everybody enjoys the beginning parts of inflation where nobody pays and everybody benefits. But sooner or later, you're going to get to the latter stages of inflation where everybody pays and nobody benefits. But as long as you keep increasing the supply of money, you start, vibrating at a higher frequency until the whole thing just collapses. And that's the danger with one of those possible outcomes is we print into infinity, and we undermine the complete society, the fabric of society, the foundation of our economic systems. And that's, I think, the danger of modern monetary theory as well. It's a flawed system. It's been proven time and time again in our history not to work. And they think, well, that wasn't real socialism. We're going to try it again.
Well, and I think changing the theory to basically compensate for our poor behavior is just a bad idea. I mean, there are principles, like I say, don't tinker with the law of gravity because it will hurt you. And that's how I feel. Don't tinker with the law of
scarcity.
Of exchange, of scarcity. You know what? There is a system and it works, but it is a fair system. And when you start to cheat on the corners and then eventually you can't help yourself but cheat right out in the middle, we've got a runaway problem. And I think society and professionals need to take some responsibility for saying, how do we combat this? And the way we combat it isn't to stand up and fight. It's to actually start educating people to say, think for yourself, begin to understand what it is, look at the history. And once you start to understand that, you're saying, hold a second, this can't possibly be a good idea.
Yeah. And I think preaching the principles of sound, objective money is a great start. We're not going to get into solutions today. Of course, we've got just a few minutes left. We're going to not be able to finish this in one go. I think this is going to end up being a possible, we're going to have a sequel of the Mike and Wayne show here. But we'll call it The Empire Strikes Back or something.
Strikes out. Yeah,
hopefully. But the principles of sound money, voting with having some critical thinking instead of, I've suggested this in the past, that if you have nothing to lose, you'll vote as if you'll have everything to gain. And we've got to stop this. We've got to restrain monetary policy. We've got to restrain governments from just saying, oh, yeah, well, no problem. Well, don't worry about the cost. The budget will balance itself. Well, that's not true at all. As a matter of fact, that's misleading on a grand scale. And I think that the more, I think it was Goebbels that said, the truth is what is most often repeated. It doesn't have to be true, but it has to be repeated often enough that the people started to believe it. And when you have political opportunists, I'll call them, who, I mean, let's be honest, most politicians, and no offense if you're a politician watching this, but they're mostly narcissistic sociopaths. And we cannot legislate out self-interest. If we think that people are greedy and self-interested, then why aren't the people who are running the systems of government also not? self-interested. It's a logical or cognitive dissonance. It's a logical dichotomy to think that people aren't self-interested running altruistic systems. Well, that doesn't happen. People remain self-interested.
Yeah, and I think that's been a challenge since the beginning of time. Uh, this this hunger for more, this hunger for, I call it greed. What else can I call it? So, I spent a fair bit of time as a parent when my kids were little, identifying the qualities and attributes of an effective human being. And I said, have you ever met somebody that's greedy? I ask people that all the time. I ask guys this week. Yes. Did you like them? No. Oh, okay. Have you ever met somebody that's generous? Yes. Did you like them? Yes. Okay. Well, what quality do you want your children to build into their lives so that they begin to exhibit that in their society? I want generosity. Okay. What did you do yesterday to instill the fundamental value system of generosity? Well, nothing. I wasn't intentional. What about today? Well, I haven't been so far. Well, what about tomorrow? Because if you continue to repeat your pattern of behavior, you're going to get the very thing you don't want, which is greed. And that's kind of where I keep saying to our society, we continue to allow people unchecked without accountability will almost always lead to greed. And we've got a lot of systems driven by greed today in a society that desperately needs honesty. They need authenticity. They need generosity. Society needs to have a service heart. And unfortunately, if we don't get accountability structures in place and reward those things, you end up with, it's just easy to print money. It's easy to buy votes. It's easy to convince somebody that needs something that you can give them a handout. And I'm going, you don't have any money. How can I'd love to help you. I don't have any finance. I'm not in the position to help you. I can't. I would love to if I could, but I can't. And I'm going, well, neither can the government, but they think they can. And then more theorists come along and say, well, I think we can build a new theory. And I'm going, well, just why don't you slide off the top of the CN Tower and see if you can build a new theory for gravity? And you can if you want to put on the right equipment, the right gear, the right safeguards, the right harnesses, but you're not going to violate the law of gravity naturally and expect to survive it. And you're not going to defy the law of economics and good business practice and survive it. So anyway, I ramble.
Yeah, no, that you're absolutely right. And I think what we'll do is we'll leave it there. We looks like we are going to have to do a sequel to this because we haven't even scratched the scratch of the scratch yet, I don't think.
Well, it's such a big issue, but I think, Mike, the conversations lead to maybe people stopping and saying, well, I disagree with that statement. Great. I'm glad you disagree. At least you're listening. At least you're thinking. At least you're taking some responsibility. Yep. Why don't you come back and help me understand where my thinking is deeply flawed and enlighten me to the truth? But that's really what we're after in a society that says there's no such thing. And I'm going, again, sorry for my repetition. Just go slide off the edge of the CN Tower and defy the law of gravity. See how that works. Or hop in the bullpen. I've been in the bullpen, and I can tell you there's a good time to get out of the bullpen, and it's long before the bull arrives.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks for this man. Chat, Wayne, and I look forward to our next session for sure.
Cool. Blessings, man. Take care.
Cheers.
IB Canada Group, your independent authority for information on the infinite banking concept.